24, Sadie Brooks buried her mother, lost her home, and became homeless. She thought her mother left her nothing, until one winter morning, she received a letter her late mother had hidden for years. Inside was a deed to an old cabin in Wyoming. Sadie almost ignored it, but beneath that forgotten cabin was a secret so extraordinary it would change her life forever, and if she hadn't opened that hidden door, she never would have discovered the final gift her mother left behind, a gift that might change the way you see your own life, too. The day Sadie Brooks turned 24, she woke up in a room full of strangers. Her mother was gone. Her apartment belonged to someone else, and the only birthday gift she received was a yellowed envelope left behind by a dead woman. That woman was her mother. It was late January in Denver, Colorado. Snow drifted outside the women's shelter as Sadie sat alone beside an old radiator, clutching a worn leather wallet. Inside it was all the money she had left, $48. A year earlier, life had been different. Not perfect, but warm. She lived in a tiny apartment with her mother, Martha Brooks. The wallpaper peeled, the heater rattled. But every Sunday morning, Martha made blueberry pancakes and told her daughter the same thing. "Promise me you'll always have somewhere to go." Sadie would laugh. "Mom, I can't even afford new tires." But Martha always shook her head. "I'm not talking about a house. I'm talking about hope." Back then, Sadie didn't understand. Then came the diagnosis. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Sadie quit school, worked 2 jobs, sold her car, then her laptop, then everything she could bear to lose. The hospital bills kept coming, but time kept running out. One snowy evening, Sadie sat beside her mother's hospital bed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Martha squeezed her hand. "For what? For not saving you?" Her mother smiled sadly. "Oh, sweetheart, you were never supposed to save me." Tears rolled down Sadie's face. "But I tried." "I know. And that's why I know you'll survive this." Sadie shook her head. "I won't." "You will." Then Martha said something Sadie would never forget. "When everything falls apart," she whispered, "don't be afraid to begin again." 3 weeks later, she was gone, and Sadie's world collapsed soon after. The bills piled up. The rent went unpaid. Every month she watched her savings disappear. $300, $100, $72, then $48. The night before the eviction, Sadie sat alone in the dark kitchen, wrapped in her mother's scarf. "I don't know how to do this without you," she whispered. No one answered, and somehow that hurt the most. 2 weeks later, she stood outside her apartment with a single suitcase. Snow covered the sidewalk. Someone upstairs was laughing. Someone else's life was moving on. Sadie waited to cry, but she didn't, because sometimes, when your heart breaks enough times, even tears grow tired. So she walked, straight to the women's shelter, straight into the loneliest birthday of her life. Until that morning, Ms. Reynolds, the shelter manager, called her into the office. The older woman pulled an envelope from a drawer. Its edges were worn, its paper yellow with age. "I've been waiting years to give you this," she said softly. Sadie frowned. "What is it?" Miss Reynolds looked at her. "Your mother left it here." Sadie froze. "What?" "She told me." The woman paused. "Don't give this to my daughter until she loses everything." Sadie stared at the envelope. Her name was written across the front, in her mother's handwriting. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside were 3 things: a handwritten letter, a property deed, and a notice from a lawyer. Transfer fee due $20. Attached to it was an address: Parcel 27B, Silver Creek, Wyoming. Sadie frowned. She had never heard of Silver Creek, and her mother had never mentioned owning land. Not once. Her hands shook as she unfolded the letter. The first line stole the air from her lungs. "My dearest Sadie, if you're reading this, then life has broken your heart the way it once broke mine." Sadie didn't sleep that night. She sat on the narrow bed at the shelter long after the lights were turned off, staring at the letter in her hands. Silver Creek, Wyoming. The words felt foreign. Impossible. Her mother had never mentioned Wyoming, never talked about land, never hinted at secrets. Yet there it was, a property deed, a transfer fee of $20, and a letter that sounded less like a goodbye and more like a promise. Sadie unfolded the paper again. The ink had faded slightly over the years, but her mother's handwriting was unmistakable. "My dearest Sadie, if you're reading this, then life has broken your heart the way it once broke mine. I prayed it never would, but I knew one day you might need this place more than you need me." Tears blurred the words. Sadie wiped them away. She kept reading. "I didn't leave you a fortune. I left you a chance. Take it." That was all. No explanation. No map. Just hope, folded neatly into an envelope. For the first time in months, Sadie felt something stir inside her. Not happiness. Not yet. But curiosity. And sometimes, curiosity is enough to save a life. The next morning, she borrowed an old computer at the shelter library. She searched. Silver Creek, Wyoming. The internet returned only a handful of results. Population 1,843. One grocery store, a diner, a church, a gas station, and miles of forests and mountains. There wasn't much else. No photos of beautiful neighborhoods, no tourist attractions, no reason at all for her mother to own land there. Sadie leaned back in her chair. This was crazy. Maybe the land didn't exist. Maybe it was worthless. Maybe the whole thing was a mistake. But then she opened her wallet. $48. That was her reality. And suddenly, a mysterious town in Wyoming didn't seem any crazier than sleeping in a shelter for the rest of her life. 3 days later, Sadie bought a one-way bus ticket. $28. After paying the transfer fee by mail, she had exactly $0 left. Ms. Reynolds hugged her before she left. "You sure about this?" Sadie laughed softly. "No." The older woman smiled. "Good." Sadie frowned. "Good." Ms. Reynolds nodded. The scariest choices usually end up changing our lives. Sadie wasn't sure she believed that, but she climbed onto the bus anyway. The ride lasted nearly 18 hours. Snow-covered plains stretched endlessly outside the window. Tiny towns flashed by. White churches, abandoned barns, lonely roads disappearing into the horizon. Sadie barely slept. She kept wondering, why Wyoming? Why now? Why had her mother kept this secret? Every answer only led to more questions. She arrived in Silver Creek just before sunset. The bus station wasn't really a station, just a wooden bench beside an old gas station. The air smelled like pine trees and snow. The mountains rose in the distance like silent giants. Everything felt quiet, almost too quiet. Sadie pulled her suitcase behind her and looked around. A few people walked along Main Street. Someone waved. A dog barked. The diner sign flickered. This place felt frozen in time. And somehow, that scared her more than the city ever did. The lawyer's office sat at the end of the street. A small brick building with a wooden sign, Turner and Blake Attorneys at Law. Inside, the room smelled of cedar and old books. An elderly man stood behind the desk. Ow, gray-haired, warm eyes. He smiled when he saw her. You must be Sadie Brooks. Sadie nodded nervously. I'm Arthur Blake. He extended his hand. I knew your mother. Sadie's breath caught. You did. Arthur smiled. For many years, 1,000 questions rushed into her mind. Before she could ask them, he pulled a folder from his desk. Inside was the deed. Stamped. Signed. Official. Arthur slid it toward her. Parcel 27B. He smiled gently. It's yours. Sadie stared at the papers. She almost laughed. It's real. Oh, it's very real. What exactly is on it? Arthur hesitated, then smiled again. A house. Sadie's heart skipped. A real house. Arthur rubbed the back of his neck. Well, it depends on your definition. 10 minutes later, Sadie wished she hadn't asked, because standing in front of her, at the end of a narrow dirt road surrounded by pine trees, was the saddest house she had ever seen. It was a cabin, small, weathered. Its paint had long since faded away. Half the roof sagged. The porch leaned dangerously to one side. One window was boarded up. Another was shattered. Snow had drifted against the walls. The whole place looked like it had been forgotten. Sadie stood there in silence. This was what her mother left her. A laugh escaped her lips. Then another, until suddenly, all creed. She wasn't laughing anymore. She was crying. Ugly crying. Standing alone in the snow with her suitcase beside her. Because she had traveled hundreds of miles chasing hope and found a broken cabin in the woods, Arthur stood quietly beside her. He didn't interrupt. After a while, Sadie wiped her eyes. I'm sorry. Arthur shook his head. Don't be. She looked at the cabin again. I thought. Her voice broke. I thought maybe things would finally get easier. Arthur was silent for a moment. Then he said softly, Your mother didn't believe in easy. Sadie looked at him. She believed in second chances. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old brass key. Its edges were worn smooth. Arthur placed it gently into her hand. She asked me to tell you something. Sadie looked up. Arthur smiled. She said, If Sadie ever comes here, tell her she's stronger than she thinks. The wind rustled through the pine trees. Sadie stared at the cabin, at the crooked porch, the broken windows, the roof barely holding on, and for the first time since her mother died, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Not certainty, not joy, but possibility, tiny, fragile, flickering like a candle in the dark. She tightened her grip around the key, took a shaky breath, and walked toward the front door, not knowing that hidden beneath that broken cabin was a secret her mother had protected for years, a secret powerful enough to change her life forever. That first night in the cabin was colder than Sadie expected. The wind slipped through cracks in the walls and whispered beneath the front door. She wore her coat to bed and wrapped herself in her mother's scarf, lying on an old mattress Arthur Blake had arranged to have delivered earlier that afternoon. The ceiling creaked. Branches scratched against the windows, and every unfamiliar sound reminded her how alone she was. Still, for the first time in months, she fell asleep somewhere that belonged to her. even if it was falling apart. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the broken window and painted golden lines across the dusty floor. Sadie stood in the middle of the cabin, hands on her hips. The place looked even worse in daylight. The kitchen cabinets hung crooked. The sink didn't work. There was a hole in the ceiling large enough to see the sky. A family of mice had apparently been living under the stove. She laughed, not because it was funny, but because crying was exhausting. "Well," she said aloud, "I guess it's you and me." The cabin didn't answer, but somehow it didn't feel empty. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Sadie found work washing dishes at the diner in town. The owner, a cheerful woman named Nancy, paid her cash and sent her home with leftover pie. Arthur stopped by twice a week, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with tools, sometimes just to check on her. He never asked questions, and Sadie appreciated that, because she still had plenty of her own. Why had her mother kept this place secret? Why Silver Creek? And why, out of all the places in the world, had Martha Brooks chosen this broken cabin? One evening, after another long day scrubbing floors at the diner, Sadie sat cross-legged on the cabin floor with her mother's letter. She had read it dozens of times, yet one sentence kept pulling at her. There are things beneath the surface that only reveal themselves when you're ready to see them. Beneath the surface? What did that even mean? Sadie looked around. Dust, wood, broken furniture. Nothing mysterious about any of it. She folded the letter away and laughed at herself. Maybe grief makes people search for secrets that aren't there. 2 days later, she almost proved herself wrong. It happened while moving an old bookshelf near the fireplace. The shelf scraped across the wooden floor with a loud groan. Then suddenly, thud, a hollow sound. Sadie froze. She tapped the floor with her foot. Solid. Then again, thud. Different? Her heart skipped. Slowly, she knelt down. The boards here were darker, older, and one corner seemed slightly raised. She ran her fingers across the edge. There. A narrow gap. Almost invisible. Her pulse quickened. "No way," she whispered. She grabbed a screwdriver from her toolbox. Pried gently. Nothing. Tried again. The board lifted slightly. Dust exploded into the air. Sadie coughed, then pulled harder. The board came loose. Underneath was darkness. She stared at it. A hidden compartment, no bigger than a closet door. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This couldn't be real. Could it? For a moment, she simply knelt there, staring, thinking of her mother, thinking of the strange line in the letter. Beneath the surface, a chill ran down her spine. Not fear. Something else. Anticipation. She grabbed a flashlight, took a deep breath, and lifted the wooden hatch completely. A gust of cool air rushed upward, carrying the smell of earth, old wood, and time. Narrow stairs disappeared into darkness below. Sadie's mouth went dry. "Mom," she whispered, "what did you leave me?" The stairs creaked beneath her feet. One step, then another. The beam of her flashlight trembled in her hand. The room below wasn't large, maybe 15 feet across. Stone walls, wooden shelves, everything covered in dust. Yet, strangely, it was dry, protected, as if someone had built it to last forever. At the center of the room sat 3 wooden crates. Beside them, a small oak desk, and resting on top of the desk, a blue ceramic mug. Sadie stopped breathing, because she knew that mug. Tiny crack near the handle. Hand-painted daisies. Her mother drank tea from it every evening. What? Her voice echoed softly. What is this place? Slowly, she approached the desk. A thin layer of dust covered everything, except one spot, a leather journal. Its cover worn smooth with age. Embossed on the front were 2 words, Martha Brooks. Sadie's knees nearly gave out. She picked it up carefully, opened the first page, and immediately burst into tears. My dearest Sadie, if you found this room, then you finally came home. Tears blurred the ink. Sadie pressed her hand against her mouth. Her mother had been here, sat at this desk, held this journal, all those years. While Sadie knew nothing, hands trembling, she turned the page. Photographs slipped onto the floor. Her mother, much younger, standing beside this cabin, laughing, holding a shovel. Another photo. A man Sadie didn't recognize. Then, blueprints, old maps, land surveys, and pages upon pages of handwritten notes. Her breathing quickened. She looked toward the wooden crates. The first one creaked as she opened it. Inside, bundles of documents. The second, old family photographs. And the third, Sadie froze. Rows of glass jars, perfectly lined up, each one tightly sealed, each one stuffed with rolled-up bills, 20s, 50s, hundreds, dozens of them. Her mind couldn't process what she was seeing. She grabbed one. Heavy, very heavy. Opened it. Money. Real money. Her hands started shaking. Another jar. Money. Another. Money. Oh my God. She sank onto the floor, surrounded by jars, surrounded by secrets, surrounded by proof that her mother had been preparing for this moment for years. But it wasn't the money that broke her. It was the next page of the journal, a single sentence, written in shaky handwriting, as if Martha knew her time was running out. I never wanted to make life easy for you, Sadie. I wanted to make sure you never gave up on yourself. Sadie cried then, quietly, not gracefully. She cried for her mother, for the hospital room, for the nights she went hungry, for the loneliness, for every moment she thought she'd been abandoned. Because she hadn't. Not once. Even in death. Her mother had been finding a way to hold her hand. Sadie sat there for a long time, the flashlight dimming beside her, the journal open in her lap, and for the first time in over a year, she didn't feel alone. She had no idea yet that the greatest secret wasn't the money, or the hidden cellar, or even the land itself. There was something else. Something her mother had protected her entire life. A secret buried even deeper. And very soon, someone would come looking for it. Sadie didn't tell anyone about the cellar. Not Arthur. Not Nancy at the diner. No one. For nearly a week, she kept the hatch hidden beneath an old rug, returning to the underground room only at night. She'd sit at her mother's desk, reading page after page of Martha's journal, and slowly, the anger she'd carried for over a year began to soften. Not disappear, just soften. Because for the first time, she could see her mother not as a mother, but as a woman who had once been young, who had known heartbreak, who had been afraid, and who had spent years quietly building something for her daughter. The journal wasn't filled with grand adventures or hidden riches. It was filled with ordinary things. Notes about planting tomatoes, recipes for apple pie, sketches of the cabin, and scattered between those pages, little pieces of wisdom. One entry stopped Sadie cold. You will spend your life meeting people who think your worth depends on what you own. They're wrong. Your worth is measured by what you build after you've lost everything. Sadie read those words again and again, because for months she had measured herself by loss. Lost her mother, lost her home, lost her plans, lost herself. But what if that wasn't the end of her story? What if it was only the beginning? The next morning, Sadie stood outside the cabin and looked at it differently. The roof still sagged. The porch still leaned. The paint still peeled. But for the first time, she didn't see ruin. She saw possibility. And strangely, that terrified her. Because hope is a dangerous thing. Once you let it in, you have something to lose again. Still, she started. She used a little of the money from the cellar. Not much, just enough. A new hammer, wood planks, roof shingles, a second-hand ladder. Arthur noticed immediately. He pulled up in his old pickup truck one afternoon and stared at the pile of supplies. His eyebrows rose. Looks like somebody won the lottery. Sadie laughed nervously. More like somebody got tired of rain leaking onto her bed. Arthur smiled. Need help? Sadie almost said no. She'd spent so long surviving alone. Accepting help felt uncomfortable. But then she remembered something her mother wrote. Strength isn't refusing help. It's learning you're worthy of receiving it. So she nodded. Yeah. Arthur grinned. Good answer. For the next few weeks, they worked side by side. Arthur taught her how to replace shingles, how to reinforce beams, how to sand wood until it felt smooth beneath her fingertips. Sadie made mistakes. Lots of them. She hammered her thumb twice, installed one window backward, fell off a ladder into a bush. Arthur laughed so hard he nearly cried. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Sadie laughed too. Real laughter. The kind that surprises you. The kind that heals something you didn't know was broken. The people in Silver Creek started noticing. Nancy from the diner brought over casseroles. Mrs. Harper from the church dropped off blankets. An elderly neighbor named Walter appeared one morning carrying flower seeds. Every home needs something beautiful, he said. Sadie stood there holding the tiny paper packets, and suddenly, she didn't feel like a stranger anymore. At night, she'd sit in the cellar reading Martha's journal, learning things she never knew. How her mother visited Silver Creek every summer. How she worked extra shifts to buy the land. How she fixed the cabin herself. And most surprising of all, how afraid she had been. One entry made Sadie cry. I was terrified every day. Not of being poor, not of failing. I was terrified I wouldn't leave you enough courage to face this world without me. Sadie pressed the journal to her chest. Oh, Mom, she whispered. You did? More than enough. Spring arrived slowly. Snow melted. Wildflowers appeared along the trail. The cabin began to change. Fresh paint covered the old wood. The porch stood straight. New curtains hung in the windows. And near the front steps, Sadie planted tomatoes, just like her mother used to. The first tiny green sprouts appeared a few weeks later. Sadie knelt beside them, smiling. And for a moment, she could almost hear Martha laughing beside her. That evening, Arthur stopped by with coffee. He sat on the porch, looking around. You know, he said softly, your mother always believed you'd come. Sadie looked at him. Even after all those years, Arthur nodded. Especially after all those years. He hesitated. Then added, she used to say. Arthur smiled sadly. My daughter doesn't know it yet. But one day she'll build something bigger than this cabin. Sadie stared at the mountains in the distance. The sun dipped below the trees, painting the sky gold. She thought about the cellar, the money, the journal, the life she'd lost, and the one she was slowly building. For the first time, she wasn't asking, "Why did this happen to me?" She was asking, "What am I going to do with this second chance?" And somewhere deep inside, for the very first time, Sadie believed she deserved one. She didn't know it yet, but the answer to that question was already making its way toward her, in a black SUV, driving up the mountain road, looking for something hidden beneath her land, something worth far more than money. The black SUV arrived on a Tuesday morning. Sadie was kneeling beside her tomato plants, brushing dirt from her hands, when she heard the sound of tires crunching over gravel. Nobody drove up this road unless they meant to. She stood slowly. The vehicle came to a stop in front of the cabin. A man stepped out, mid-50s, expensive coat, polished shoes that had clearly never touched mud. He looked around the property, not with admiration, but calculation. Then he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. "Miss Brooks?" Sadie nodded cautiously. "I'm Sadie." The man extended his hand. "Victor Hayes." He glanced toward the cabin. "And this," he said, "is exactly where I hoped you'd be." Something about him made Sadie's stomach tighten. "What can I help you with?" Victor slid his hands into his coat pockets. "I represent Hayden Ridge Development." Sadie had never heard of them. "We specialize in eco-resorts, luxury cabins, private communities." He smiled again. "And we're very interested in your land." Sadie blinked. "My land? Parcel 27B. He nodded toward the forest behind her. "We'd like to buy it." Sadie almost laughed. A month ago, she was homeless. Now a stranger in an expensive SUV wanted her broken cabin. Life was strange. "Sorry," she said. "It's not for sale." Victor didn't seem surprised. "Everyone says that at first." He pulled an envelope from his pocket. Inside was a check. Sadie stared. $75,000. Her breath caught. $75,000. More money than she'd ever seen in her life. Victor watched her reaction carefully. "You could buy a house anywhere you want. Go back to Denver. Start over." He tilted his head. "What exactly are you staying here for?" Sadie looked past him, toward the porch she'd rebuilt, toward the tiny tomato plants, toward the mountains her mother once loved. A month ago, she would have taken the money, without hesitation. But now something felt different. She folded the check and handed it back. "I'm not selling." Victor's smile faded. "You should think carefully." "I have $75,000 is a lot of money." Sadie shrugged. "So is having a home." Victor's eyes narrowed. "You know," he said slowly, "your mother turned me down too." Sadie froze. "What?" Victor sighed. "I came here years ago." He looked out at the trees. Martha wouldn't even discuss it. Sadie's heart started racing. "Why?" Victor hesitated, then smiled. "I guess she never told you. That night." Sadie couldn't stop thinking about his words. She waited until the cabin was quiet, then climbed down into the cellar. The journal lay where she'd left it. She turned pages frantically. Land surveys, notes, receipts, old photographs. Then, tucked between two pages, a folded map. Her hands trembled. A blue line crossed the property, circled several times in red ink. Beside it, her mother's handwriting. "Spring Source." Below that, pure water, protected. Never sell. Sadie's pulse quickened. She kept reading, and suddenly, everything changed. Her grandfather had discovered the spring nearly 60 years earlier. Natural water, filtered through layers of limestone deep beneath the mountains. Cleaner than anything nearby. Martha inherited the land. But she never registered the spring. Never told anyone. Except Arthur Blake, and apparently, Victor Hayes. The next morning, Sadie drove straight into town. Arthur was opening his office when she burst through the door. "You knew?" Arthur looked up, then saw the map in her hand, and sighed. "So," his voice was soft, "you found it." Sadie dropped the journal onto his desk. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Arthur removed his glasses. "Because your mother asked me not to." "Why?" "Because she was protecting you." "From what?" Arthur stood, walked to the window, and pointed toward the mountains. "People kill for water out west." Sadie frowned. He wasn't joking. "Your spring is one of the cleanest natural sources I've ever seen." He looked back at her. "And the rights belong entirely to you." Sadie stared at him. "This little piece of land," Arthur nodded, "is worth far more than that cabin." "How much?" Arthur smiled. "Enough to make people greedy." Suddenly, Victor Hayes made sense. The expensive SUV. The offer. The smile that never reached his eyes. He didn't want the cabin. He wanted what was beneath it. Sadie sank into the chair, overwhelmed. Just a few months ago, she was counting pennies, sleeping beside strangers, praying for a second chance. Now she owned something valuable, something powerful, something her mother spent years protecting. Arthur opened the journal. There, on the final page, was a note, written shakily, probably near the end of Martha's life. Arthur slid it toward Sadie. She read silently, "My dearest Sadie, if you've reached this page, then you know the truth. This spring could make you wealthy. But wealth is a strange thing. It reveals people for who they truly are. Promise me this. Never let fear make your decisions. And never let money become your home. A home is something else entirely. It's the people you protect, the life you build, and the courage to stay when leaving would be easier. Love, Mom." Sadie read the letter twice, then a third time. Tears filled her eyes, not because of the spring, not because of the money, but because even now, her mother was still teaching her, still guiding her, still believing in her. Arthur sat quietly beside her. After a while, he asked, "So, what are you going to do, Ma?" "Oh, Ahmad." Sadie looked out the window, toward the mountains, toward the cabin, toward the place she once thought was worthless. And slowly, a smile appeared on her face. Small, but certain. "I think," she said softly, "I'm finally ready to build something." She didn't know exactly what. Not yet. But for the first time in a very long while, Sadie Brooks wasn't afraid of the future, because the greatest gift her mother left her wasn't the land, or the spring, or even the hidden money. It was the belief that a broken life could still become something beautiful. And Sadie was finally beginning to believe it too. For most of her life, Sadie Brooks thought strength looked like never needing anyone, never crying, never asking for help, never letting the world see how scared you really were. But standing in the cellar beneath her cabin, her mother's journal open in her lap, she finally understood something Martha had been trying to teach her all along. Strength wasn't about surviving alone. It was about choosing to keep going, even after life gave you every reason to stop. Spring slowly melted into summer, and somewhere between fixing the porch railing and planting tomatoes beside the front steps, Sadie began to change. It wasn't dramatic. There was no grand moment, no sudden burst of confidence. It happened quietly, like sunrise. She noticed it the first time she walked into the diner and stopped apologizing. The first time she disagreed with someone and didn't feel guilty. The first time she looked in the mirror and saw someone her mother would be proud of. Arthur noticed too. One evening, they sat on the porch drinking coffee as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. "You stand differently now," he said. Sadie laughed. "What does that even mean?" Arthur smiled. "It means you stopped waiting for life to happen to you." He pointed toward the cabin. "You built this." Sadie looked around. Fresh paint, new windows, flower boxes beneath the porch, tomatoes climbing wooden stakes. She remembered the first day she saw this place. Broken, abandoned, just like she felt. And now, both of them were healing. She spent more and more time reading her mother's journal. Not for secrets anymore, but for comfort. Martha had filled the pages with little lessons, things she'd learned the hard way. One entry made Sadie stop. "You don't become brave when fear disappears. You become brave when something matters more than fear." Sadie closed the journal slowly, because for the first time, she knew exactly what mattered. This place, this life, and the promise she silently made to her mother. "I won't run anymore." The people of Silver Creek had stopped calling her the girl from Denver. Now she was simply Sadie. Nancy at the diner saved her favorite pie. Mrs. Harper invited her to Sunday supper. Walter taught her how to grow roses. Even children waved when she drove into town. It was strange. After losing everything, she had found a community. Not because she asked for one, but because she stayed long enough to belong. Then came the letter. Official, stamped, delivered by certified mail. Sadie stared at the envelope before opening it. Her stomach twisted. Somehow, she already knew. Hayden Ridge Development. They were requesting access rights through her property, claiming public interest, offering compensation, threatening legal action. The words blurred before her eyes. She read them twice, then a third time. The fear came rushing back. Hot, familiar. The same fear she'd felt at the hospital. The same fear she'd felt standing outside her apartment with a suitcase. The fear of losing everything. Again, that night she barely slept. The cabin creaked around her. Rain tapped softly against the roof, and Sadie lay awake staring at the ceiling. Maybe Victor was right. Maybe she should sell. Take the money. Move somewhere warm. Start over. Wasn't that easier? But then she remembered her mother. Not sick in the hospital. Not weak. She remembered Martha kneeling beside tiny tomato plants. Hands dirty. Smiling. Saying, "Roots matter, Sadie. You don't throw them away because storms come." The next morning, Sadie drove straight to Arthur's office. She dropped the letter onto his desk. "They want my land." Arthur adjusted his glasses, read quietly, then leaned back. "They want your spring." Sadie crossed her arms. "Can they take it?" Arthur smiled. Not kindly. The sort of smile lawyers save for people they intend to beat. "They can try." For weeks, Arthur worked beside her. Paperwork, water rights, land surveys, permits. Sadie learned more about contracts in 1 month than she had in her entire life. At first, she was overwhelmed. Then, she got angry. Why should she be afraid? Why should she surrender something her mother spent decades protecting? Why should powerful people always win? So she fought. Not loudly, not bitterly, just firmly. Every signature felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Every meeting made her stronger. Victor Hayes sent new offers. Bigger checks, larger numbers. Sadie rejected every one. One afternoon, Victor arrived in person. He stepped from his SUV looking annoyed. "You don't understand what you're turning down." Sadie smiled. "No, I understand exactly." Victor sighed. "This could make you rich." Sadie looked past him. Toward the cabin, toward the roses Walter helped her plant, toward the tomatoes growing beside the porch, toward the life she almost never had. Then she looked him straight in the eye. "I was homeless 6 months ago." Victor blinked. "I slept in a shelter. I lost my mother. I lost everything." She took a step closer, and somehow, she smiled softly. "That was the best thing that ever happened to me." Victor stared at her, speechless, because he couldn't understand. People like him thought wealth meant owning more. Sadie had learned something different. Wealth was waking up without fear. It was loving where you lived. It was planting roots. It was building something worth protecting. Victor left that day, and as his SUV disappeared down the mountain road, Sadie didn't feel scared. Not anymore. Because somewhere along the way, the frightened girl who counted her last $48 had become a woman her mother always believed she could be. That evening, Sadie climbed down into the cellar. She opened the journal one more time. Near the end, Martha had written, "One day you'll realize, I wasn't leaving you land. I was leaving you the chance to discover who you are." Sadie's eyes filled with tears. She smiled and whispered into the quiet room, "I know now, Mom. I finally know." But neither Sadie nor her mother could have imagined what would happen next, because the story of the girl who lost everything was about to spread far beyond Silver Creek, and soon, people from all over the country would come searching for the little cabin in the mountains. Not because of the spring, not because of the money, but because of the woman who refused to give up. The first snow of winter arrived early that year. Sadie stood on the porch of the cabin, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee, watching tiny flakes drift lazily from the sky. The roof no longer leaked. The porch no longer leaned. And the windows she had once covered with plastic to keep the cold out, now glowed with warm yellow light. For a moment, she simply stood there, listening to the wind in the pine trees, to the crackling fire inside, to the silence she used to fear. Funny thing about silence. When you're lonely, it feels unbearable. But when you finally found peace, it feels like home. A year ago, Sadie had nowhere to go. Now, people came looking for her, not because she was rich, not because of the spring, but because of her story. The young woman who lost her mother, lost her home, lost almost everything, and somehow built a new life from the ruins. The local newspaper wrote about her first, then a regional magazine, then a podcast. Soon, people from neighboring towns began showing up. Some brought flowers. Some brought questions. Others brought heartbreak. One afternoon, a young woman named Claire knocked on her door. She couldn't have been older than 22. Her eyes were swollen from crying. A duffel bag hung from her shoulder. "I heard about you," she said softly. Sadie invited her in. They sat by the fire. Claire told her story. A sick father, medical debt, an eviction notice, nowhere to go. Sadie listened quietly, because she knew exactly how hopelessness sounded. It sounded like speaking softly, because you no longer believed anyone could save you. That night, after Claire had fallen asleep on the couch, Sadie sat alone in the cellar. Her mother's journal rested open in her lap. She ran her fingers across Martha's handwriting, and suddenly, she understood. Maybe the cabin was never meant to save only one person. Maybe that was why her mother left it behind. Not as an inheritance, but as an invitation to keep the kindness going. The next morning, Sadie made a decision. She converted the old tool shed behind the cabin into a tiny guest house. Nothing fancy. Just a bed, a little kitchen, a rocking chair on the porch, and a small wooden sign hanging beside the door. Second Chance Cottage. The first guest stayed 2 weeks. The second stayed 3 months. Then came another, and another, a widow who lost her home, a young mother escaping abuse, a woman recovering from addiction. Sadie never charged a dime. She only asked one thing. When you're back on your feet, she'd say, help someone else. Arthur laughed when he first saw the sign. You know this is going to get out of hand. Sadie smiled. I hope so. Arthur shook his head. You sound exactly like your mother. Well, maybe she did. Because somewhere along the way, Sadie stopped asking why life had hurt her, and started asking, what can I do with the pain? How can I make it mean something? The answer was always the same. Open the door. Set another plate at the table. Tell someone, I know you're scared, but you're going to be okay. Years passed. The tomatoes still grew every summer. The roses Walter planted bloomed brighter each spring. Arthur retired but still stopped by every Friday. Nancy from the diner brought pie. Claire eventually moved away. Before leaving, she hugged Sadie and whispered, You gave me my life back. Sadie smiled. No, you did that yourself, but deep down, she knew. Sometimes people don't need saving. They just need someone to believe they can save themselves. One autumn evening, Sadie stood beside her mother's grave overlooking the mountains. The sky burned orange. The wind carried the smell of pine and wood smoke. She brushed leaves away from the headstone and smiled. You were right. Her voice trembled. I thought losing you was the end. Tears filled her eyes. But it wasn't. She laughed softly. It was the beginning. Sadie looked toward the valley below. The cabin lights glowed warmly. Smoke curled from the chimney. The guest house windows shined softly in the fading light. And for a moment, she imagined her mother standing beside her, hands tucked into her coat pockets, smiling that quiet smile. Proud. The truth was, Martha Brooks never left her daughter a fortune. She left her something far more valuable, a place to begin again. And through that gift, Sadie discovered something extraordinary. Home isn't a building. It isn't money. And it isn't the place where life never hurts. Home is the place where pain no longer has the final word. It's where you learn to breathe again, to trust again, to hope again. Years ago, Sadie Brooks arrived in Silver Creek with $48 and a heart full of grief. She thought she had lost everything. She was wrong, because sometimes, when life takes away everything you planned, it quietly gives you the life you were always meant to live. Martha Brooks never left her daughter a fortune. She left her something far more valuable, a place to begin again, the courage to keep going, and the belief that even after the darkest winters, spring always comes. Maybe that's the lesson hidden inside all of our struggles. That losing your way doesn't mean losing yourself. that broken hearts can heal, that it's never too late to start over. And sometimes, the place where you cry your hardest becomes the place where you smile again. The place where you arrive with nothing becomes the place you finally call home. Because home isn't where life is perfect. It's where hope lives. And as long as hope lives, a new beginning is always possible.